The philosophers in most departments in the United States today, I think, focus largely on the Western world, whether that's ancient Greek or ancient Greece or modern Europe, or what's written in contemporary analytic journals in philosophy. And in no department that I've ever been at have I seen a course in Africana philosophy, which I think is sociologically quite interesting. And this makes me think that I ought to ask to start out with, since I don't think, one, this is going to be a super simple answer, and two, a lot of our audience might not be familiar with Africana philosophy, just how the two of you think of Africana philosophy. So what is it?
Well, if I might start, and Chike, you weigh in whenever the spirit moves you.
Sure.
First of all, the term Africana is what I call a covering term. It in some ways, the term works like we might say the term Europe works. So that Europe is a term that covers a huge geographical expanse within the context of which there are lots of different nation states, peoples, histories, cultures, etc. But in a sense, it's a gathering term, a term under which lots are gathered. And there's a presumption of very important commonalities, actually definitive commonalities, by way of which that term can cover all this expanse of geographic expanse, but also historical and cultural expanses are soon to be appropriately covered by this one term, because what is covered includes some quite definitive commonalities and similarities, as well as differences, etc. So the term Africana philosophy is meant to cover articulations, expressed thoughtfulness by various people, African and of African descent, whenever and wherever those articulations are forged and given expression, however they are. So it's meant at this very high level covering, much the way the term Europe covers, or the way the term the America covers, or the term South America covers. But as you start to descend from that high level, you begin to get into the particularities, the distinctions, as well as the commonalities. And as you get lower to the ground, you're constantly trying to adjudicate the question, well, what are the shared similarities and our commonalities and the differences? And as John Dewey might ask, what are the differences that make a difference? And once we take up the differences, are the similarities still so compelling that the term makes any sense to do all this gathering work? So in some sense, the term is a heuristic covering term, but it has to be made good on much closer to the ground by getting in and beginning to look as close to the ground as you possibly can at various people's histories, cultures, articulations, language, all of that, institutions and cultural life, and find those things that are similar, common, and different, and then revisit the question, well, does the covering term really do the work that we had anticipated heuristically, or do we have to let go of some things?
What I would add is that I definitely count as someone who thinks we don't need to let go of the term, that it does significant work. And some of what I might add in support of that, when we say that it covers philosophy by Africans and also people of African descent, right? The phrase "people of African descent" there it points to important historical processes, right? What we call the creation of the African diaspora, and with diaspora being this term that means scattering of a people outside a homeland, right? And so because the modern era, so to speak, right? Because, in the last 500 years or so, one of the most important factors in world history was the scattering of African people outside of Africa through especially the transatlantic slave trade, right, and the creation of these diasporic African populations, right? So that particular history, right, is part of what the term is able to address, right? And and the other point that I'll just quickly make to, again, say what I think sort of makes good on the term, to use Lou's words, you have figures in the tradition who, themselves are awkwardly pinned down to one, let's say, geographic location. So to take a figure from the 18th century that I've thought a lot about, Kwabena Otoba Kugoano, right, who wrote a book commonly referred to as Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery. So that book, which came out in 1787, it was written in the UK. So maybe you want to call it Afro-British. At the same time, he was originally from what is now Ghana, right? So maybe you want to call it Ghanaian, but that's actually confusing because they didn't have country. They didn't have the same borders that give us Ghana today, right? And so maybe now you want to say his specific ethnic group, the Fanti people, right? But then, to really understand his thought, you need the fact that he experienced slavery in the Caribbean, right? Particularly Grenada, and he's known to have also visited certain other islands while enslaved in the Caribbean, right? So if we just take that one figure, Africana, right, the way that it's a covering term, very easily catches him, right, in a way that when we start thinking of these other terms, well, okay, they're doing well enough, but they're certainly not telling the whole story, right? To me, in that situation, Africana tells the entire story, or tells you the foundation of the story that you can then fit all those other geographical pieces into. So that would be, for me, one of the examples of why it has, to me, proven its value, right, as a heuristic term.
Both of those answers were really great. Could you, Chike, repeat his name? Because I'm not sure I quite caught it.
Yeah, so he's known as Kwabena Otoba Kugoano. And I'll spell that partly because it's even just interesting. There's some interesting aspects to the spelling of his name. So when he published his book, even though he had been using the name John Stewart in correspondence, right, he found it important to publish the book using his African name. This is also something that his friend Olaudah Equiano, who wrote a book called The Interesting Narrative and Autobiography, he too, found it important to use his African name, even though he was also known as Gustavus Vasa. In any case, coming back to Kugoano, right? Well, the last name there, Kugoano, we spell Cugoano, right? And Otoba, which comes before that, is Ottobah. But what's really interesting to me is the first part, which he spells Quobna, right? Kwabena. And why I say that part's interesting is because if you meet lots of Ghanaians today, you'll find that Kwabena is a rather common name, right? And it's standardly spelled like Kwabena, right? Because we live at a time when lots of people who have that name have to figure out how to spell it in, the Roman alphabet. But he, is making it up as he goes along at that point, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why it's interesting that what we normally today spell Kwabena, he's spelling Quobna. And so even in his name and the spelling of his name, you see his important historical process whereby this African is inserting himself, right, into European conversations, using the English language to dissect slavery in a work of political philosophy, because that's what Thoughts and Sentiments is. It's an attack on slavery, but it's also a reflection on many of the important questions of political philosophy in terms of, what a just society looks like, and how you repay wrongdoing, and a number of other fundamental questions of political philosophy. So he's a fascinating figure to me that way.
That's one of the things we can think about. Robertson is saying, what is that present in a lot of the dominant mainstream departments of philosophy in this country? Certainly, we could go to the analytic traditions and find lots of very substantive, even classical works on the significance of language and of naming.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So now, however, the matter of naming in this figure is not a matter about logic so much as there's another driving force at work here that has to do, if you will, within perhaps the deepest, most existential sense, with the very nature of one's self-understanding, mm-hmm. and how one would identify oneself in a world that has been radically altered and structured around invidious racisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where there has been a profound philosophical anthropology, metaphysics, ontology, theology, all supporting the hierarchical ordering of the world along racist lines under the governing logic and practices of white racial supremacy. Mm-hmm. So his move to enter into discursive spaces by reclaiming for himself a name given to him as a person African is not an exercise in the logic of naming, since in the significance, the real philosophical significance, the anthropological, the historical, cultural, the very identity of one's being by virtue of one's name, and the reclaiming act. What does it mean to reclaim one's name for oneself under these historic conditions? And that's worthy, I think, of a seminar in any self-thought reputable philosophy department in any place. Mm. Or as Chike's generation might say, I'm just saying.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd never even thought about that. I mean, in most, and I'm not the end-all be-all final arbiter of the analytic philosophy of naming, but questions of naming in analytic philosophy typically concern causation, reference, possible world semantics, and never do you really hear about self-understanding and these sorts of historical concerns. But Chike, I'm so glad that you brought up Kwabena Otuba Kugoano, because I hadn't come across him in my preparation, but he totally exemplifies the utility of Africana. His background does. I mean, why this term is so useful. And something that I think is worth mentioning before we go on, this idea of a covering term is so neat and so useful, because I mean, it's obvious to you too, just how expansive culturally, socially, and geographically Africa is, especially when you take into account this scattering that you just mentioned, Chike. But I don't think everybody realizes it. And I certainly didn't realize this because it's downplayed in history books in today's culture. So I first realized this my freshman year of undergraduate when I was taking a class on the history of Royal African art. And our professor had a slide on the screen in which he showed like a conventional globe or a picture of a map, I don't quite recall, in which Africa looks pretty small. But then he showed the same image where things are things are the size they actually are, and Africa just totally consumes Europe and the United States. It is so much bigger than both of them, but I treated or thought my entire life as if Africa was kind of just this homogenous country-sized mass out there.
Well, maps are very, very interesting. And one of the things I have wanted for a very long time would be to have a graphic, something graphical on a computer where you could take the continent of Europe, for example, and for a particular, along a timeline, have the borders of what is considered Europe shown, and then show as you say you drag across the timeline, see what happens to the borders of what is called Europe, but also see what is happening to the borders of what are called states, principalities, or municipalities, or whatever at any given time they were called. If you drag along that timeline, what does that look like across history? What do those borders look like? And if you could just have a graphic where you just pull slowly across a timeline and watch what happens to the whole configuration, as well as what's happening internal to that configuration in terms of states and borders and et cetera, I think it would be pretty, we'd have to give up on certain naive notions about geography and the determination of geographical boundaries as though they are naturally fixed in some ways, because we now know even borders or even shorelines are being changed by what's happening with the earth. And that's not new. That is, walking across the Bering Strait. Well, you can't exactly walk across the Bering Strait anymore, right? So that the shifting of the geography of the earth has been going on for a long time, but we have these notions as though they refer to something fixed. Right? And at one point there were the analysts who thought if we get the reference right, we've got everything nailed down. Well, that to which we're referring isn't as stable as sometimes we thought, particularly if you were going to impose a kind of logic on the referent, that it had to be stable in some way in order to do the referencing work. Good luck with that. That didn't work out very well as a strategy of philosophizing, right? So it's interesting to begin with. And again, to me, this compels us to come to terms with the evolutionary history of our species and all that goes with that in some sense.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. I imagine, though, that borders just in their own right are a huge component of African and Africana philosophy. I think I read in the SEP article that, for instance, Egypt was something that Europe was in a way kind of always trying to steal from Africa and classify as the Middle East, as part of the Middle East for some sort of...
Hegel was explicit about it. Hegel was explicit about it in his philosophy of history. He says there's nothing happening below the Sahara Desert. There's nothing happening there that is worthy of historical consideration. And let's remember, the term history is doing really, really crucial, critical work for him. So when he says there's nothing historical happening, there's a way in which these are not history-making people in the sense of what full human beings are. Egypt, if you've got pyramids, it's a little hard to say nothing is happening there, because, right, just thinking, well, how the hell do you build those? I mean, I've been to the pyramid. It's pretty, I can remember one of my expressions was standing beside a pyramid, which, it's interesting when I stand any place else and look up at the sky, right, and you see clouds moving is one thing. It's another thing when you stand beside a pyramid, and I had a sense that the pyramid was stationary. The sky was doing something else, but this damn thing was so massive, that the universe moved around it. Because I was just so awestruck by the sheer scale of the thing, and that they are constructed out of blocks of enormous size, but rather exact proportions. And further, if you're standing by a particular one, you can see all the way to the city of Cairo and across the other side of the city. And a guide is saying, oh yeah, these were mined in a quarry way beyond what is now Cairo and then brought over here. You see, they're like, well, there were no 18-wheelers. There were no cranes. How the hell did they quarry these big stones? And I mean, these are huge things. And then figure out how to stack them. I mean, they weren't mixing concrete. They didn't have glue. They had a way of stacking and ordering these with tunnels inside the stairs and all of this. And you sit there just marveling at this. And so Hegel is like, okay, those people south of the Sahara, okay, they don't have anything historic, but this stuff up here in Egypt, this is clearly historic. So he just says, Egypt, we must annex to Europe. He just outright says, we must annex Egypt to Europe. And everything else below that we can forget. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there of historical significance.
Yeah.
Something I'd add, you were reflecting on having had a sort of a smallish Africa in your head, right? And a more homogenized, Africa in your head. And so it's absolutely important to emphasize in response to a history of misinformation, right? That Africa is so much more diverse, to speak just of Africa, and then of course adding the African diasporas again to add more diversity, right? And so that's right. But at the same time, right, even this phrase, Africana philosophy, is doing what? It's unifying that diverse array of spaces, right? And there's Africana philosophy. Another important term that I would introduce here is Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Africanism we could say is an important strand within Africana thought generally, and Africana philosophy in particular, right? And so Pan-Africanism is the view according to which, right, in spite of or alongside the diversity that must be recognized, there should also be a sense of unity, and that is going to be the best way for African people to move forward, right? And while we can treat that as, right, in its own way a contentious claim, I think that the fascinating thing is it is not the case that to be a Pan-Africanist is to deny African and African diasporic diversity, right?
Right, the country.
Right. That being said, it is compatible to be a Pan-Africanist and to recognize, celebrate, explore the diversity, right, of African peoples. But that being said, right, to promote unity, you could say, can at least make the temptation, right, of de-emphasizing diversity, of suggesting that we are all one way in some sense. And Lou and I would both agree that there are folks who have done better or worse, right, at managing that tension, at calling for unity with or without, right, de-emphasizing or hiding from, right, the internal diversity here, right? And to me, when you see that kind of tension, when you see that kind of difficulty, right, it's possible, it is compatible to do both the calling for unity and the recognizing of diversity, right? But there are pitfalls here, right? There are ways in which you can stumble in trying to do that, right? That is, to me, just one of the things that shows you why this is a philosophically productive, right, tradition, right? Because there's so much to think about in terms of how to get that right, and so I think that that diversity and also that call for unity, one which is important to me and in many ways orients my own thinking, right? That kind of tension calls for philosophical thinking and shows what makes, to me, Africana philosophy so fascinating.